The Watchmen from 2009, apart from being one of the best superhero movies ever created with its societal criticism, its catharsis-inducing violence, the dark but brilliant symbolism of its characters, and a couple of other things, at the same time manages to encompass one of the oldest, deepest and most fundamental conflicts in moral philosophy. Without further ado, I give you the dark detail in Watchmen that you probably missed. Let's do a brief thought experiment. Think of the world you live in. Let's be real, some things are really shitty, admittedly. Your job sucks, you're still single, you're still living at home, as well as of course all that other stuff like famine, disease, wars, sure. What if you could change all of that and instead create a utopia? Whether it be a peaceful world where no wars ever occurred, where no one needed anything, where there was no sickness, where even someone like you could get a girlfriend, whatever. Sounds pretty awesome, right? Now, there's just one little problem. For some reason or another, and this is super frustrating, you just have to kill a couple of people to get there. Just a couple, maybe a few thousand, maybe a few millions, whatever. Because the fact remains that your utopia is going to benefit the rest of the billions of people living on planet Earth. Now, why would you have to kill those people? Well, maybe they're actively working against you, and of course all of the great things that this new world of yours would entail. Or maybe they just don't understand your vision. If they did, they wouldn't work against you, of course, that's obvious. And if another person can't see reason, if everything that stands between this world and your future utopia is a couple of million idiots or saboteurs, then I guess it would be necessary to remove this obstacle. And apart from necessary, would it in fact not be moral to get rid of these people? I mean, imagine how much you could improve the lives of billions of people and how many more would be saved by this utopia of yours. I guess based on that, we could conclude that it would be pretty much unethical to let a few bad eggs stand in the way of so much happiness and greatness. This is one of the most fundamental questions in moral philosophy. For now, I want you to just hold on to your answer. The thing is, this question represents nothing less than an epic battle between two schools within moral philosophy. One that is just as relevant today as ever. One that is responsible for many of the great tragedies of the 20th century and will be responsible for the many tragedies that are to come. Namely the conflict between deontology and consequentialism, usually, and in this case, in the form of utilitarianism. Now let's look into what these are and how they fit into the grim dark narrative of the Watchmen. But first, I'm going to share with you a few other of my favorite dark details of this movie that most people probably missed.
Tell me, what do you see?
But first guys, please remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell if you want an update the next time I post one of my videos.
What are you waiting for?
Okay, let's go. Watchmen from 2009, directed by Zack Snyder, is a gritty and philosophical adaptation of Alan Moore's graphic novel set in an alternative 1985, where superheroes have shaped world events, altering the outcome of the Vietnam War and accelerating the Cold War tensions. These so-called heroes operate under the shadow of existential dread, with the clock ticking towards potential nuclear annihilation. The story begins with the murder of Edward Morgan Blake, known as the Comedian. His death sparks an investigation by his former, let's call it colleague, Rorschach, a vigilante who refuses to abandon his uncompromising, morally black and white worldview. Now Rorschach's investigation leads him to uncover a massive conspiracy involving his fellow Watchmen, forcing them all to confront their values and roles in society. Now of course there's no reason to go through the plot in more detail, as if you're seeing this, it means that you're probably a nerd like me, who has probably already watched the movie 60 times. So let's instead look into who these characters are. And by this I mean who they really are.
My face! Give me back my face!
Let's take a look. First, of course, the Comedian.
It's all a joke.
In this story, he's a reflection of America's darker impulses, embodying the moral bankruptcy and excesses of power. Philosophically, he represents moral nihilism and a violent view of the world. He treats life as a cruel joke, using violence indiscriminately in his role as both a soldier and a government-sanctioned hero. And as we see in the movie, his cynical worldview and moral nihilism leads him to do terrible things, from war crimes to personal atrocities. The Comedian represents the darker aspects of American patriotism and military interventionism. His character is a critique of American foreign policy during the Cold War, showcasing the potential hypocrisy in claiming moral superiority while engaging in morally dubious actions.
What happened to the American dream? It came true.
In this way, the comedian is a walking contradiction. A hero who believes in nothing and exposes the absurdity of hero worship in a morally compromised world. But despite his cynicism, the comedian serves as a mirror to society's failings, questioning the legitimacy of heroism in a flawed world. The comedian somewhat embraces the meaninglessness of life, the irony of morality, of course manifesting itself in the way he constantly refers to everything as a joke. And the fact that he does this makes him, to a certain extent, one of the only trustworthy characters in this story. Whereas many of the other characters are somewhat blinded by idealism rather than facing realism. Next, Dr. Manhattan. Manhattan symbolizes godlike detachment and the dangers of absolute power without empathy or morality. A scientist transformed by a nuclear accident, he gains near omnipotent abilities but loses touch with humanity as a result. His blue collar and ability to perceive time all at once emphasize his alienation from human concerns, symbolizing a higher intelligence that cannot relate to human life's emotional dimensions.
While I am standing still.
He's immortal, which of course distances him from the self-awareness and the search for purpose that comes with knowing that you are going to die.
A live human body and a deceased human body have the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no difference.
In a strange way, Dr. Manhattan and the comedian represents the same stance on morality, namely essentially that there is none, that nothing matters, and that life is meaningless.
You could have turned the gun into steam, the bullets into mercury, the bottle into goddamn snowflakes, but you didn't, did you?
And they both on several occasions point out the absurdity or hypocrisy in human morality and behavior.
You complain that I refuse to see life on life's terms. Yet you continuously refuse to see things from my perspective.
Now, Dr. Manhattan also represents another fascinating philosophical perspective, namely that of determinism, seeing human life as a series of preordained events.
Why even argue about it if you already know how this is going to end?
I have no choice.
In a wider context, he reflects the Cold War anxieties about nuclear power and the consequences of advanced technology. His detachment can be read as a commentary on how scientific progress can sometimes evolve too fast and lose sight of its human impact. Dr. Manhattan questions the possibility of true human connection and serves as a critique of the Superman ideal, suggesting that power without compassion, or more importantly, morality, is pretty dangerous. Silk Spectre, aka Laurie. Now, Laurie symbolizes the struggle for identity and autonomy. As the daughter of the original Silk Spectre, she was pushed into the role of a superhero by her mother's expectations. Throughout the story, she grapples with her legacy, personal desires, and her complicated relationships, especially with Dr. Manhattan, of course, who is increasingly detached from her as well as the rest of humanity. In fact, the relationship between her and Dr. Manhattan represents the very conflict between agency and determinism. Laurie representing the belief in free choice, and Manhattan, of course, representing the assumption that the idea of choice itself is irrelevant.
Everything is preordained.
Now, at the same time, we've often heard the argument that Laurie represents the struggles of women navigating identities imposed by family and society. Her character also somewhat sheds light on the emotional toll of living in a world where women often face exploitation. Laurie's journey in the story reflects themes of personal growth and self-discovery in a world dominated by men who control the narrative of heroism. Though personally, I find this interpretation to be a bit too superficial, but alright. Night Owl, aka Dan Dreiberg. Now, along with Laurie, Dan is probably meant to be the most human of the characters. He is first and foremost a symbol of nostalgia for a simpler, more innocent era of heroism. He carries on the mantle of his predecessor, the original Night Owl, out of a genuine desire to do good. Unlike the other heroes, he is morally grounded, though of course somewhat passive and idealistic. Dan, of course, represents a longing for traditional heroism that is sort of becoming obsolete in a darker and more cynical world. And what is interesting about him is that he is driven by an innate desire to do good, rather than acting according to some abstract moral framework. We see this, for instance, at the end of the movie in the way that Dan reacts more emotionally to the death of Rorschach than the death of millions of people. Night Owl's character essentially reflects disillusionment with a hero archetype in a world that no longer seems to believe in simple good versus evil narratives. motives. He symbolizes the inadequacy of well-meaning intentions in the face of complex moral dilemmas. That sometimes the desire to help just isn't good enough in a corrupt and compromised world. Questioning whether there is still a place for good guys in a modern world.
No! You haven't idealized mankind, but you've deformed it. You've mutilated it.
And that ultimately takes us to the main dark detail of this movie. The philosophical rift that I was referring to earlier, and the last two of our main characters, each symbolizing one of the two schools of morality, deontology and utilitarianism. So let's start with deontology. Of course, championed by our very own and my personal favorite character of this movie, Rorschach. Alright, Rorschach represents moral absolutism. He sees the world in black and white with no room for nuance or moral grayness, which is of course symbolized by his inked blood mask that constantly shifts between black and white but never blends shades. His uncompromising stance on justice and rigid worldview make him both admirable and terrifying. As we see in the movie, he becomes a vigilante after a traumatic childhood and experiences with humanity's darkest sides, leading him to view people as fundamentally corrupt and deserving of punishment.
Because there is good and evil must be punished.
Rorschach embodies extreme moral rigidity and cynicism about humanity.
When you walk down the street in a city dying of rabies, you really feel normal.
He is somewhat also the opposite character of Night Owl, because he is driven primarily by a moral code and a set of rigid principles, rather than empathy or belief in his fellow man. Something which is pretty clearly insinuated in the monologue in the beginning of the film.
And all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us." And I'll whisper, "No."
As a social commentary, he can be seen as a critique of the vigilante archetype, questioning the consequences of someone who takes justice into their own hands without any restraint other than his own moral absolutist code. In a broader sense, he also reflects Cold War era fears, embodying a kind of conservative worldview that sees existential threats everywhere and a lack of belief in the good of mankind. But more importantly, as mentioned earlier, Rorschach embodies deontology. This school of moral philosophy states that principles or actions are themselves either morally just or morally unjust, regardless of their consequences. In other words, the end does not justify the means. For instance, a deontologist regarding lying as morally unjust would argue that it remains unjust, completely irrespective of whether lying might lead to a perceived positive outcome. The same with murder, of course. We see this manifested in the way that Rorschach upholds a rigid moral code that refuses to bend even in the face of apocalypse.
Everyone's gonna know what you've done.
Will they?
He believes in absolute justice, where good and evil are as distinct as black and white. And he is of course both feared and respected for this relentless pursuit of truth. But his uncompromising nature also makes him dangerous and isolated even from those who are closest to him.
God, who do you think you are, Rorschach? You live off people while insulting them, and no one complains because they think you're a damn lunatic.
Rorschach is a powerful and clear demonstration of deontology, exactly because he upholds a strict moral code, pursuing what he defines as justice even if it leads to negative consequences for himself or society. For him, truth and justice are absolutes. And as you know from watching the movie, he refuses to compromise them, believing that the ends never justify breaking his own personal moral code. This unwavering adherence to principle, even when it is personally costly or conflicts with others' welfare, serves as a classic example of deontological ethics in action. And it is best understood through what is probably one of the most amazing quotes in movie history.
Never compromise. Not even in the face of Armageddon.
And now, of course, lastly, Ozymandias. Being the opposite of Rorschach, he represents utilitarianism taken to an extreme. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral philosophy which holds the maximization of overall happiness to be the ultimate moral end. Let's take a look at why that is. Ozymandias, aka White, is a highly intelligent and wealthy individual who believes he must save humanity, even if it means sacrificing millions of lives. A phenomenon and mindset also known as noblesse oblige, not not that uncommon to contemporary society as well. Ozymandias, of course, foresees that the US and the Soviet Union are on the brink of nuclear war, which would result in catastrophic loss of life. Believing that humanity must have a common enemy to avoid mutual destruction, he devises a plan to unite them against a perceived external threat. His aim is to prevent nuclear annihilation, which he of course views as a moral imperative for the greater good of mankind.
Peace based on a lie.
But peace, nonetheless.
Veidt's plan involves causing a massive explosion in New York City and a number of other great cities around the world. Small bonus detail is that in the comic, this is a fake alien invasion and not an explosion, by the way. Now, this act of destruction kills millions of innocent lives, but he believes the sacrifice is justified if it saves billions of lives by preventing nuclear war.
Killing millions.
To save billions.
And it is through his morally controversial but calculated actions aimed at achieving what he believes to be the greater good that Ozymandias embodies utilitarianism. This is the ultimate utilitarian calculation. He chooses to commit a horrific act with the belief that it will result in a net gain of happiness by ensuring peace. Furthermore, Ozymandias goes to great lengths to ensure that no one can stop his plan, including manipulating and deceiving his former allies, the Watchmen. He of course tricks Dr. Manhattan and even murders the comedian to hide his intentions, all to guarantee that his vision of a peaceful world through forced unity becomes reality. He reasons that deception is necessary to maintain the illusion and to achieve the greater good of lasting peace.
Dad, a world united in a peace that had to be sacrificed.
Now, if you've read Plato, another consequentialist moral philosopher, in fact, the moral philosophical father of totalitarianism, you will know that this corresponds to Plato's noble lie, which states that rulers can morally lie to their subjects to maintain social harmony and the stability of the state. So again, on the one hand, we have deontology, embodied in the moral absolutist Rorschach. Actions and principles are in themselves good or bad. In other words, if it's bad to murder an innocent human being, then it's bad no matter the consequences. And consequentialism, embodied in the utilitarian megalomaniac Ozymandias. Again, here actions or principles are good or bad based on their consequences. In other words, murdering a human being is good or bad depending on the overall consequences of doing so. Now, even though you might look at the destruction or murder of millions of people with horror, there is no doubt that utilitarianism is a moral philosophy which appeals to a lot of people. And there are several reasons why this idea of overall happiness as being the ultimate moral end might feel tempting to so many of us. The primary reason probably being the mere simplicity of that proposition. Because what we essentially do is compare numbers, or at least we think we compare numbers. Go back to the question I asked you in the beginning of this video. Would you sacrifice, meaning murder, say 1,000 people if it meant creating something much greater for everybody else? And would you murder 10 people to save 1,000? Now, it's a comparison which seems simple enough, and therefore it leads to a conclusion that is very intuitive and therefore easy for many to accept. I mean, it seems completely counterintuitive to sacrifice 1,000 to save 10, right? But the question that you really want to be asking yourself is, how do you know that you have to make that choice? And even if you have to make that choice, how do you know for sure that you're making the right choice? Because the problem is that even though utilitarianism seems simple, even though it appeals to so many of us, it is extremely dangerous. Indeed, collectivism, the primary component of literally any totalitarian ideology, often uses utilitarianism as its moral justification, as it provides much less constraints than deontology. Utilitarianism serves as the moral justification for this political super philosophy, because it provides the talking points for anyone, including of course totalitarian regimes that seek to argue that not only is it necessary to oppress the individual, but it is also moral, all for the sake of the greater good. And it at the same time serves as a way to convince individuals that they must always sacrifice themselves for the good of the collective. It is moral to steal other people's property. It is moral to take people's lives away from them. And it is moral to murder, say, 100 people as long as you can argue that this leads to the maximization of happiness for all of the people that are left alive. Of course, the more power you have, the less you actually have to argue anything. At some point you can just do it if you want, and utilitarianism in this case might then just act as a way of you steering clear of cognitive dissonance by justifying your actions to yourself. But that's another story. But was Ozymandias right? Does it make sense to murder a few millions to
Save billions.
No, here is why utilitarianism in general does not make sense. Utilitarianism might also appeal to you because you like the idea of everyone being happy. But the problem is that wanting other people to be happy is not good enough. To be able to carry out utilitarianism in practice, you must presume to know exactly what makes other people happy. In other words, you need to be able to clearly define other people's happiness on their behalf, to quantify their happiness. Now, of course, understanding what makes me happy as an individual is something that might take me as an individual a lifetime to comprehend. And yet, no, sure, you as a utilitarian, you understand what makes thousands if not millions of other people happy. You are able to define the happiness of millions of people on their behalf, including your own. You need to presume that you are able to do this, because how could you otherwise make the calculation and justify the trade-offs on other people's behalf? So the first problem is, of course, that it requires an enormous amount of arrogance and in fact narcissism to carry out utilitarianism in practice. Something which fits perfectly with Ozymandias. A man who regards himself as the smartest man alive. A man who has decided to name himself after a pharaoh. A man who compares himself to Alexander the Great.
And so began my path to conquest.
Now, second of all, you must presume to understand the trade-off itself. In other words, even if you knew exactly what my happiness looks like, how would you know exactly how to obtain that happiness? But I guess Ozymandias' trade-off seems simple enough, right? By saving the lives of as many people as possible, he presumes that overall happiness is also thereby maximized. And Ozymandias is, as already mentioned, convinced that there will be nuclear war if he doesn't do it. And I guess if this is true, his actions seem pretty rational, right? But the big problem here, of course, just as I mentioned before, is that in this story, it is in fact not at all certain that there's going to be nuclear war. And not only is it not certain, you could easily make the complete opposite assumption.
What are the chances the Russians will actually attack the United States? Pat Buchanan.
0. The Soviets would never risk going to war when we have a walking nuclear deterrent on our side.
There are plenty of reasons why nuclear war was not very likely. In fact, to bend our brains just a little bit further, Dr. Manhattan himself, when trying to see into the future, he himself says that his vision is blocked by some kind of interference. His own explanation for this?
In all likelihood, nuclear holocaust.
Of course, what blocks his vision is a combination between the tachyon radiation emitted by Ozymandias and the one that comes from the explosions that Ozymandias himself uses to kill millions of people. Which means that the warnings of Dr. Manhattan himself, the ones that motivated Ozymandias to do what he did, were all warnings based on what Ozymandias was indeed going to do in the future. As per usual with things that has to do with time and movies, it quickly becomes a little too much to think about. But what is important to remember is that in real life, nobody can see into the future. Nobody can know the exact consequences of their own or anybody else's actions, just as nobody can know exactly how to maximize the happiness of millions or billions of other people. Therefore, utilitarianism remains a moral philosophical instrument for the tyrant who wishes to justify his repressive or monstrous actions to himself or others. And it remains the attractive dream of the narcissistic megalomaniac.